What's up, metal and heavy music fans? Today we are ranking the albums of Septicflesh. Alright, let's start at the beginning, all the way back in 1994 with Mystic Places of Dawn. Now, if you've listened to their earlier records, it is a very different scene from their newer ones. I will admit right up front, take my thoughts on these earlier albums with a grain of salt because one, I just like that symphonic death metal sound much better. It appeals to me a lot more. And two, I'm just not a big doom metal fan. And let me tell you, a lot of these earlier albums, they're basically straight up doom metal albums, and that's definitely true of Mystic Places of Dawn. This is a very slow, methodical, doomy record. It does have a few songs that I enjoy on it, like Return to Carthage is pretty good, Behind the Iron Mask. The Dream Lord also has a really cool string intro. So it's an okay album. I'll bet there are people out there that absolutely adore the early discography. I know Quest for Metal has a tier list that is not up at the time of me recording this, but I have a feeling that he really enjoyed these earlier albums. But yeah, for me, it's just like a C. It's kind of okay. Again, I'm ranking these so that we're differentiating between like my favorites and my not so favorites. So this is not to say this is a bad album by any stretch. It's just definitely pretty low down in terms of my thoughts on Septicflesh's discography overall. But let's move on to 1995. They were really cranking out these early albums, just like year after year. We've got Esoptron, and Esoptron, kind of similar feelings here. More doom. We do get some kind of more gurgly kind of death metal vocals on this one, ramping up the extremity a little bit, I would say. Again, a couple decent songs on here. Rain. I like the little interludes sprinkled throughout as well. So Clean, So Empty is pretty decent, but so clean, so empty, so boring. I'm sorry. Like, I find this album to be incredibly boring. I do actually like Mystic Places of Dawn better than this one. I think it's a more interesting record, and this one just doesn't do it for me really at all. So a D for that one, and I know that's going to upset some people. Those Esoptron fans out there, I sort of apologize, but not really, because this is just my opinion. It's all subjective. Let's move along to 1997. With the Ophidian Wheel. This album finds Spyro sounding a little bit more like himself. I feel like the vocals sound more kind of like patented Septicflesh at this point. Definitely a more death metal album too. There's still plenty of doom metal on here as well, but it's kind of alternating, and there are definitely some more kind of just traditional death metal sounding song structures on here. The Future Belongs to the Brave has a really great intro. I love the female operatic vocals that are actually sprinkled throughout this album. Definitely stepping up sort of the sense of grandeur that we later will come to expect from this band. I like the title track. Tartarus is a pretty interesting one too. This is more of like an avant-garde, like dramatic piece. Just feels like something out of a musical. So that one's kind of interesting. You definitely see them experimenting more with sort of the orchestral sound overall. So yeah, this one's another one where it's kind of a C. I don't love it as much as their later stuff, but as far as their like 90s era albums go, it's an interesting one. It's kind of cool to see their evolution into that more symphonic sound. Next up, we've got 1998 with A Fallen Temple. This one has kind of a shift again into some of the more kind of rock elements the band likes to incorporate at times too, but alongside still the death metal and the symphonic metal elements. The problem is they're not very well integrated. Like, it's just constantly like kind of this like jump here and jump in this style, and each song kind of has a different feel to it. It ends up feeling like this weird jumbled compilation where the songs just like don't fit together very well as a whole. So overall, I feel like this album is like a step back from the Ophidian Wheel. The three-part Underworld, big epic operatic piece in this album is really cool. Like, I almost feel like that should have just been like its own standalone EP, and it would have been more fitting, because again, like the way that it's put together with this, it's just this clash of all these different sounds that don't really fit together. You've got heavier songs too, like The Crypt, which I like, but again, like within the track listing, they all are just kind of like, I'm doing this and I'm doing this. It doesn't feel like a team effort. Everybody's kind of doing their own thing. Erebus is alright, but overall, definitely one of my least favorite albums. It's got some really cool, interesting moments on it, but as a whole, it's not something that I want to like continue to go back and revisit because it is kind of just so clunky. Then we've got Revolution DNA 1999. This is the first album to really start getting that 2000s vibe, with the real shift into kind of what I associate with that Septicflesh sound, in terms of like they're fully formed. When you think of Septicflesh, you think of this is how it sounds. And so the production has more of that 2000s vibe. The songwriting also has shifted. It feels a lot more consistent. And we also get some more of those weird warbly kind of trademark clean singing moments that show up on pretty much all the albums from this point forwards. Definitely just an interesting sound that I very much associate with them. This is, though, a less symphonic album. It feels like they're more playing with kind of the more gothic and death metal elements of their sound. It almost feels like a Rotting Christ album in some ways, which is not too weird because they did know each other. And around this time, Spyros actually did album art for one of the bigger Rotting Christ albums. I like Science, Revolution. Radioactive is great. This is kind of like this album is the beginning of them doing more like infectious sing-alongs too, which is not something you normally like associate with some of these more extreme bands. But from here forward, again, we have those more like chorus moments where you know the words and you scream along or you sing along depending on the situation. And I feel like Radioactive is a great example of the beginning of that. So overall, this album it's imperfect and it's a little bit inconsistent. There's some really great tracks on here, but also some kind of like lukewarm ones, but there's really nothing bad. It's definitely too long. There are too many tracks on this album, which I feel like is a sign of the times again. Like around this time, everybody was shifting more and more to CD, and it's like, oh, we have so much more space. We can like fill it up with all this other music, and it made for some very bloated albums. But I gotta say, overall, of those 90s era albums, this is my favorite. I really enjoy this one. Surprisingly so, too, because I don't re-listen to this one as much, but going back and playing all these again to kind of check them out, preparing for my rankings, I quite liked it. I had a good time with this one. There wasn't really a point where I wanted to like skip. I kind of enjoyed the entire experience. So, solid album, pretty fun, too. And yeah, that is it for Revolution DNA. Let's move on, though, to Sumerian Daemons. Now, for me, this is where Septicflesh truly starts being Septicflesh, which is kind of unfortunate because this is where they broke up originally, like right on the same year that they put out this album. But of the albums that don't have the full-on symphonic element with the orchestra, it's definitely my favorite. I would put this one at B tier as well. I'd almost consider putting it at A tier. It's better than Revolution DNA, for sure. But they're still kind of like pretty close in terms of their sound. I just think this one is more consistent. And yeah, these are the albums that I actually like own from them from here forwards too. But there are so many good moments on this. Unbeliever is such a great song. A great opening track, just super heavy. And this is another one too where like it's super aggressive, but you've got a really catchy, simple sort of chorus, I guess you could call it, with just the bouncy unbeliever. This part here with the little groove. Lots of like cool chuggy parts too. And then they do get much more symphonic on this album, for sure. It's just not with the full orchestra. It's more with synth and chorals and everything. Dark River is a nice one. A very kind of gothic flavored sounding track. Love the guitar harmonies on this one. I love the balance on this album of just the really aggressive, extreme death metal components and the symphonic and gothic elements, unlike what I was saying with A Fallen Temple. Like, it all comes together so nicely on this one. The title track here, Sumerian Demon, very cool intro, very just epic again sounding, but more matured. The songwriting on this is just so much tighter. And again, there's not really like a bad song on here. The Watchers is another personal favorite. Another very memorable guitar hook on the beginning there. Just these like sultry, moody, again kind of gothy sounding guitar melodies, but interwoven. Yeah, I like this little creepy guitar sound there too. Oh, and this big build with the corals. And Spyros just sounds so good with his vocals on this album too. Red Code Cult also. I mean, I could go on and on. Virtues of the Beast, whatever. But yeah, this is a really good album. And like I said, at least B tier, if not A tier. It kind of wobbles in between there. I'd give it like a B plus A minus, at least if I was actually grading it as an album. All right, but let's move along here to the big daddies here, in my opinion at least. We've got Communion from 2008. This is when the band reformed after their initial breakup, and holy cow, is this a monument of an album, and has so many like great reviews behind it for good reason. And it's just blowing it out of the park on this one. This is also the first to include a full orchestra, and it was arranged by Christos Antonou, who is the guitar player, because he obtained his master's degree in concert music from the London College of Music. So good for him, and it paid off in dividends, because you can hear just the strings on here right from the beginning with Lovecraft's Death. The chorals sound better too. Like, it's just all live, real orchestra, and it just makes such a difference when it's live strings and instrumentation. Just so stunning. Anubis, which is what the album art is, by the way, in case you didn't know. Still more of those gothy, catchy, infectious guitar harmonies, too. This also has that weird, warbly, clean singing, too. I love that riff. There's so many cool riffs on here. And then the big chuggy part, and then where is the little chorus, the little sing-along part? Here we go. Anubis! Excellent. Communion, this intro. Just spiraling down into hell on this one. So cool. And the horns, the brass. It's just stunning, captivating. Like, again, much better integration of all those elements that they had played with in their earlier discography, just coming together. Babel's Gate I particularly like too. Great drumming too. I don't talk a ton about Septicflesh's drumming, but it's really great. And seeing them live too, performing these tracks, is just excellent. I love this close too, where everything's just going crazy. Babel's Gate. Persepolis later in there too. It's just kind of bouncy. The bass on here too, really cool. Yeah, another album. All these albums from here on out, like, I could go on and on talking about them, but they're so good. I was actually going to put this at A tier, because I do have albums I like a little bit more than this one, but I feel like I got to put it at S tier. For like a comeback album, just knocking it out of the park. Pretty much every song is great. There are some moments where I kind of drift a little bit. I think the first half is a little bit stronger than the second half, but ultimately, yeah, I think it deserves to be at S tier. But let's plug along even further to The Great Mass in 2011. Another just incredible monument of an album. If you have not listened to this album, you need to listen to this album. Like, if I were to recommend a Septicflesh album to somebody who's never listened, it would be this one, most likely. Potentially Communion. But I think this is taking everything that Communion did and just making it even better. You open with the Vampire of Nazareth, with this slow build, eerie singing, and the strings, and the pounding drums, and those big chugging riffs come in. And it's just like so violent and dark, and it's just gorgeous. Those pounding toms, Pyramid God, more great hooks. Again, they know how to have this like perfect balance of just these infectious melodies with the really aggressive, violent stuff too. And it's like they have a similar sort of approach, I would say, overall to kind of Dimmu Borgir. But honestly, I don't know. I'd give it to Septicflesh for doing it even better, I think. Obviously, Dimmu Borgir more black metal, Septicflesh more death metal, but there's just like so much crossover in their sound, it almost seems like a moot point. Oceans of Grey, kind of a deeper cut that I really enjoy. Again, the orchestral elements just so powerful. And I appreciate that the band started taking more time between the albums to really get stuff together and arrange them so well from here on out. It's just amazing. The Undead Keep Dreaming, goes back to more just sort of a straight up more gothic sounding track with the weird clean singing. And then the Undead Keep Dreaming. Awesome. Mad Architect. Dun, 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 dun. This part kind of reminds me more of like Karish Angren with the more kind of whimsical, almost Danny Elfman sounding strings on this part, and the little, I think it's a harpsichord or something that they're like really furiously pounding on, and then it builds up into this massive thing. But really, every song on this album is incredible. Love it to death. This is the other S tier album, and I like it more than Communion personally. But yeah, so they're very close, and they're both so good. Let's continue on to Titan in 2014. Now, a lot of people dumped on this album, and I just don't get it, because to me, this is like The Great Mass Part 2. Maybe that's part of it, like people were comparing it so hard to The Great Mass, expectations were so high that, you know, in most people's mind, they couldn't fully live up to it. But I honestly think it's as good. Like, it has as many bangers. It's as consistent. I love every track. There's no moment on this album that I want to shut it off. And it's just so well arranged. So I don't get it. Like, I really love this album. You got Burn. Just... Dun, dun, and then that drum part, that snare kicks in. Big choral. Oh, I love that. The big brass. I think that's like a French horn or something. And then, yeah, this moody gothic section again. Lots of dynamics on this album. Love this intro for the Order of Dracul, which is just a great song in general. Learn. Or is it learn? I never learned the lyrics right. Prometheus is incredible. Just a captivating track. Another, like, really quiet, slow intro. Just amazing melodies and just so dramatic. Like, this could easily be like a Broadway musical, just with additional death metal vocals. Yeah, it's just stunning. It's really stunning. There's no other way to put it. I absolutely love it to death. No pun intended. Titan, the title track. The way that the drums and guitars come together on this one too, it really does feel like a big lumbering Titan. It's just this giant. And those strings, like, come on. I implore you, if you were one of the people who crapped on this album when it initially came out, go back and re-listen to it. I think you'll be genuinely surprised. Confessions of a Serial Killer, also great. Those drums, man. Those toms. Just gets better and better every album. So excellent. I love it. I love this album. I really do. Like, honestly, I would put it up with The Great Mass, but I'm going to go ahead and put it at A tier. So it doesn't quite have the same impact, I guess, or legacy as these two, and that's really the only difference for me. Like, songwriting-wise, I think it's just as good, and I'd still argue that it might be more consistent and a little bit better than Communion, but it doesn't, again, have that same sort of legacy, so to speak. Moving on, we've got Codex Omega from 2017. Now, I had high expectations for this album, definitely, because they had just knocked it out of the park with every album since, 2003 at this point, and it's like, how could they go wrong? And they didn't. Like, this is still a solid album, but I definitely don't like it as much. Like, it's more bloated, again, I would say. Like, it's an hour and 12 minutes. Some of it's with this, like, extra stuff, too, to be fair. But it's still quite long, even in comparison. Titan was 46 minutes, 44 minutes for The Great Mass, and this one's, like, over an hour. And there's some really great parts on here. Portrait of a Headless Man. Really enjoy that one. I think that was one of the lead singles. Fun stuff, just chuggy. But you can already hear, even on this song, the songwriting's not, like, kind of as complex or interesting, but you know, it's enjoyable, but it just doesn't have the same flair. I like Martyr a lot. I like this opening kind of acoustic, like sort of Spanish guitar stuff on it, and then again busting into this big powerful riff. But again, if you listen to this, comparing it to the albums we just listened to, very similar, but not as good. It's like just sort of retreading ground they've already done, but not as effectively, if you ask me. But yeah, I like Martyr. I like Enemy of Truth. Yeah, again, great string intro, but very reminiscent of stuff from the last two albums. And big chorals again. Great stuff. Like, it's a fun album. It's definitely not a bad album. And then there's other songs that aren't my favorites that I still enjoy. Faceless Queen. I like that little break there. It just feels like it wasn't quite finessed as well. They didn't put the same level of sheen and intensity into the whole thing. Intro track's good too. But yeah, overall, I just don't enjoy it as much as these other albums. So that's kind of a B tier from me. I'd even argue I think Sumerian Daemons is better. So I'm ranking those kind of in order. If you go from back to front is kind of the way that works out. Alright, well, it's been a long road and several pounds later waiting for this album, but Modern Primitive is finally here, so let's get right into it. The Collector opens on the appropriately bombastic note we've come to expect from the band, with the eerie ambience of strings and regional instruments giving way to gigantic explosions of brass. And expect quite a bit of this more kind of Middle Eastern sounding influence over the course of the album. Hierophant follows this up with more of those big, lumbering, giant riffs, but also delightfully classy strings and exotic sounding backing vocals. I love the quiet little Danny Elfman-esque break in the middle that only further elevates the impact of the louder parts. And Spyros' death growls sound absolutely deranged. Self-Eater keeps things moving with a real stomper of drums and guitar pounding the listener in unison to its infectious beat, and besides the usual impressive orchestral work, the backing chorals and ululated singing make this one soar even further into the stratosphere right through its gorgeous sand-swept outro. Neuromancer continues to broaden the repertoire of backing sounds and instruments with mandolin on the earworm intro before the kaiju awakens once more with that monstrous main guitar hook. Another great middle section here too, with the start-stop riffs over the pounding of the snare sounding almost industrial in nature. Coming Storm is appropriately titled, with the strings taking center stage, building from almost imperceptible at first to a raging whirlwind of screeching bows alongside wailing brass, woodwinds, and crunchy syncopated guitars, breaking again for a wispy female vocal performance like a siren's call before everything goes absolutely mental. I think as far as orchestrations go, this is arguably one of their best to date, as well as another standout vocal performance for Spyros. A Desert Throne contrasts more great cinematic strings worthy of Lawrence of Arabia with infectious headbang-worthy riffing, epic in every sense of the word, and the scale continues into Modern Primitives, by the end feeling like the climax of some grand gothic opera. While Psychohistory doubles down on intensity with its brutal descent into madness, complemented by the simple but fun to scream along to title. Then closing with the dueling melodic leads of A Dreadful Muse over a culmination of basically every trick the band have used up to this point. Putting it all together, holy shit, y'all. I apologize for ever doubting Septicflesh after Codex Omega. This is 39 minutes of some of the band's best work to date, and while that runtime may seem short given the almost 5-year wait, it was absolutely worth the time for the band to hone this thing down to absolute perfection. So while it's a little too early to pit Modern Primitive against Communion or The Great Mass, I could potentially see this one rising to the top in the coming months. For now, I'm putting it very firmly at the top of A tier, just below those two. Y'all check out this playlist for more metal tier lists. I've got like Flesh God Apocalypse, Dimmu Borgir, some other related stuff in there. And then let me know down in the comments, what do you think of this album and what's your favorite Septicflesh album overall? But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.